there's a strange kind of exhaustion, the kind that doesn't come from working too hard. It comes from thinking too much, from replaying conversations long after they've ended, from mentally preparing responses that will never be spoken, from carrying words inside your mind like unfinished business. And the more you try to figure things out, the louder everything becomes. Not outside, but inside. You may have noticed this. Moments when everything is technically fine, nothing urgent, nothing broken, and yet your mind refuses to sit still. It keeps searching, it keeps analyzing, it keeps filling the silence. But here's something most people overlook. It's not noise that confuses us. It's our resistance to silence. Because silence feels unfamiliar, sometimes even uncomfortable. We've been conditioned to believe that clarity comes from more thinking, more explaining, more reacting. But what if clarity doesn't come from adding more? What if it comes from removing what isn't needed? There's a quiet strength in that idea, a kind of strength that doesn't force anything. And maybe, just maybe, the clarity you've been looking for has been waiting in a place you've been avoiding. So the question becomes, what if silence isn't empty, but actually full of something you've been missing? Let's explore that. Many people associate silence with absence. They think, if I stay quiet, I'll be overlooked. If I don't respond, I lose control. If I don't explain myself, people will misunderstand me. So they fill every gap. They speak quickly. They react instantly. They explain more than necessary. Not because they're wrong, but because they believe clarity comes from expression. And in some cases it does, but not always. Because there's a subtle misunderstanding here. We assume that the solution to mental noise is more mental activity. But that's like trying to calm water by stirring it harder. It doesn't settle. It only becomes more unclear. Silence, on the other hand, is often mistaken for weakness, especially in a world that rewards quick responses and strong opinions. If someone pauses, if someone chooses not to react immediately, it can be interpreted as uncertainty. But in reality, that pause can be a form of control, a form of awareness, a quiet decision not to let every thought become a reaction. The Stoics understood this well. They didn't see silence as something passive. They saw it as something intentional. Not the absence of thought, but the space where thought becomes clear. And once you begin to see silence this way, you start to realize the issue isn't that life is overwhelming. It's that we rarely give ourselves the space to see it clearly. So what changes when we stop trying to control everything with words? Imagine this. You're in a conversation. Someone says something that could easily trigger a reaction. In the past, you might respond immediately, defend your position, clarify your intent, explain your side. But this time you pause, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. You allow a moment of silence. And in that moment, something interesting happens. You notice your initial reaction, but you don't become it. You see the impulse without needing to act on it. And suddenly, you have a choice. That's the power of silence. It creates space between stimulus and response. And in that space, clarity begins. The Stoics believe that we are not disturbed by events themselves, but by our interpretation of them. Silence gives you just enough distance to examine that interpretation, to ask, is this worth reacting to? Is this even true? Does this matter in the long run? And often, the answer becomes simpler than expected. Not everything needs your voice. Not everything deserves your energy. And not every thought needs to be followed. This doesn't mean withdrawing from life. It means engaging with it more deliberately, like someone who doesn't rush into every current, but chooses when to step in. Because clarity doesn't come from reacting faster. It comes from seeing deeper. And silence is what allows that depth to exist. Let's look a little closer. Why does silence feel uncomfortable for so many people? Because when everything becomes quiet, you begin to notice what's underneath. The thoughts you've been avoiding, the questions you haven't answered, the tension you've been carrying without realizing it. Noise distracts. silence reveals. And at first, that can feel unfamiliar. But over time, something shifts. You begin to see that most thoughts are temporary. They come and they go, like passing weather. But when we react to every thought, we treat each one as if it matters, as if it needs to be solved. Silence changes that relationship. It allows thoughts to exist without immediately attaching meaning to them. This is where clarity begins, not by eliminating thought, but by no longer being controlled by it. The Stoics practiced this through reflection, not constant analysis, but quiet observation. They understood that the mind doesn't need to be forced into clarity. It settles naturally when it's not constantly stirred. And this applies beyond just thinking. It applies to emotions, to conversations, to daily life. When you don't rush to fill every silence, you begin to notice things more clearly. The tone behind words, the intention behind actions, the difference between what matters and what doesn't. And gradually, without effort, your responses become simpler, more precise, less reactive, because they're no longer coming from noise. They're coming from clarity. So how do you bring this into your life? Without turning it into another task. You don't need to force silence. You simply allow it. Start with small moments. When a conversation ends, don't rush to fill the gap. When a thought arises, don't chase it immediately. When something triggers you, give yourself one quiet breath before responding. That's all. Not a technique, not a rule, just a pause. And in that pause, ask nothing. Just observe. You might notice that many things resolve on their own. Words become unnecessary. Reactions soften. Clarity appears without effort. You can also create intentional moments of silence. A short walk without your phone. A few minutes sitting without distraction. Even just noticing your surroundings without labeling them. These aren't practices to master. They're simply ways to reconnect with stillness. Because silence isn't something you do, it's something you return to. And the more you return, the more natural it becomes. Until eventually, silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling steady. At the end of the day, nothing in your life needs to be forced into clarity. Not your thoughts, not your decisions, not your path. Because clarity isn't something you chase. It's something that appears when there's enough space for it. And silence is that space, not as an escape from the world, but as a way to see it more clearly. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, not by what's happening, but by everything you're thinking about it, you don't need to solve anything immediately. You don't need to explain. You don't need to react. You can simply pause. And in that pause, you may begin to notice something subtle. You were never as stuck as it felt. You were just surrounded by noise. And once that noise softens, what remains is something simple, something steady, something clear. So if this helped you see things a little differently, and you'd like more reflections like this, consider subscribing, not for more information, but for more moments like this one. Quiet, clear, and just enough.